Welcome to another episode of Voices. I'm your host, Keston Jones. Visionaries offering information with clarity, expertise, and substance. We are content experts. Let your voice be heard. Welcome to another episode of Voices. I'm your host, Keston Jones. And with me today, I have another special guest. I have Mr. Moses McBride. Mr. McBride.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for being on the show today. And so far since we started Voices, we've covered a number of areas. We covered criminal justice reform. We covered the importance of providing support for returning citizens. We've covered issues as it relates to being an entrepreneur. A host of other issues. But one of the things I felt like it was important for us to cover was that of relationships. In the work that I do, we often work with young men and women who are involved in relationships, and for some reason, seemingly after a couple of weeks, couple of months, even a few years, these relationships dissolve. Case in point, we have, those of us who watch popular culture, you have the recent relationship of Cardi B and
Offset.
Offset, yes. Mm-hmm. And seems like they just got married, had a child, and then after, seemingly a couple of months, they're now announcing their divorce. And I wish them all the best because I believe it's important for children to have a stable parent, stable co-parenting relationship. So hopefully they can work that out, especially as it relates to the children. But today I really want to talk a little bit about what we need to do in terms of men and women working together in order to salvage these relationships, in order to really find out why these relationships don't work. And for this particular interview, from a male perspective. And one thing I want to do is I want to have both male and a woman's perspective, and also bring us back so we can have this discussion on a panel. But without further ado, I know I'm going on and on and on, but without further ado, I'd like to really, first of all, give you a chance to introduce yourself. This is Moses McBride, someone who's done tremendous work in the community, a change agent. I solely respect this individual tremendously in terms of the work that you do. So please tell us a little bit about yourself before I go on. I know I can go on and on. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you. Again, I'm Moses McBride. I work for the Fortune Society. I'm a program supervisor of job readiness there. I'm also a fatherhood study coordinator working with a company called MDRC. I'm a student at John Jay College.
Shout out to John Jay.
Criminal Justice. I'm also a David Rockefeller Fellow, Phi Kappa Theta honor student. I don't want to talk too much about what that means.
And you're also a father.
And I'm also a father, and I've also been in several relationships. I understand relationships from a different perspective, and maybe that perspective can give some insight to people who are learning how to navigate through that. And I really think that this is an important topic for us to discuss today, just generally because we got a misconception about what relationships are and what they should be. And so, this is a great opportunity for me to speak to that.
Absolutely. I mean, in particular, when we think about relationships, we watch it from, I'm talking about from people of color, and we watch it from a Eurocentric perspective. Boy courts girl, they go out on a date. Boy goes to girl's father, asks for her hand, so on and so forth. But in many of these relationships, the women in many of these communities that we work in and that we frequent don't have fathers in their lives, may not have had an example of a positive male role model, and vice versa, and the same thing for young men. So some of our relationships don't fall under the guidelines that many of us may see on television. So it's important to also understand that maybe we should also rethink or look at what these relationships look like and how these relationships developing in terms of looking at or even talking about this subject. We see on TV a lot of these talk shows, but we often don't hear from males. and how males view these relationships. So for my first question to you, what is a successful relationship as it relates to a male's perspective?
Great. Well, let's start first by let's look at what relationships as a definition should be, right? Because when we hear relationship, we look at a boy and a girl, man and a woman, husband and wife, and we kind of put that into this picture of what society has created. But relationships is how you engage with people, right? And that's a general concept. We place it into the bonding of a man and a woman, dating. We create this idea that relationships now are just boy and girls, but relationships are how you relate to human beings. And so the best way to learn how to be effective in relationships and to be successful is to understand human beings. As a friend, my best friend, we have a relationship, and it is true. And so you got to understand even your friendships, right? And so what makes a relationship successful is one that you have to allow people to become their own owners. This is the sense of agency. You have to allow them to be who they are. And generally, when people meet, they never present their true selves. They present the image of what they believe that person that they're courting wants to see. And so we put up this facade about who we are initially. And as time goes on, when we start to get closer to that person and feel like we've solidified our position in that person's life, we start to drop those facades and become who we really are. And sometimes that is now creating the conflict. It's creating a buildup of resistance. And so first, successful relationships are first allowing individuals to remain and be comfortable with who they are without trying to change them or without us trying to change into something that we're not, just in order to create that bond. So we have to establish it on some type of authenticity from the offset. You know,
So speaking
onset.
So speaking of change, and this is something that happens, or we discuss. We discuss this amongst ourselves in our own social groups and our own peer groups, where I met this person and we're in a relationship, and I want them to change. But the question is, can someone truly change someone? Like, what does that mean? Like, when somebody says that, what does that mean?
Everyone can be changed. Human beings are the most adaptable creatures on the planet Earth. And so that means that they can evolve and adapt to any circumstance, to any condition of wherever. And that means in relationships too. In fact, in my manuscript, Getting What You Want Anytime, Any Place, we have a chapter.
Your manuscript?
Yeah, so I've written a relationship book. It's unpublished today, but eventually, I will bring it out to the public. It's just an opportunity for it to be put together in a nice format and then distributed. But right now, it's just in its late stages. It's definitely complete. Just looking to figure out when. But anyway,
so folks, be on the lookout for this manuscript. But also, just and I know you don't really like to speak about this, but you also you write for an online magazine as well, V.O.I.C.E magazine, as well as you have your own column. In this column, can you talk a little bit about that before we move on?
Well, it's V.O.I.C.E mag. You can look that up on your internet search, V.O.I.C.E mag.com. In that venue, for me, I write a column. People ask questions, I answer. It's called Mosito Says, and that's my nickname, Mosito. And I discuss relationships. What it is that makes great relationships. I do often cite things from my manuscript in that particular venue. It helps to open up the discussion, but of course, people are wanting to know about how to make relationships better. And I think part of our responsibility is to understand more about what relationships are so that we can give better advice.
Yeah. So going back to the topic of change.
Oh, yes.
So
and there's a chapter in that book where I talk about your ability to create the person that you want. And the illustration that I use, strangely, I use an illustration from Dr. Frankenstein's monster. We realized that in Dr. Frankenstein's monster, what he did was he took pieces and parts of all of these individuals, right? And he put them together and he shocked it with electricity and it came to life, and he created this being from all of these diverse parts. And then he was like, it's alive, and he was so excited about the creation of his own. And then eventually that creation went rogue, and then he said, I've created a monster. And we create all the time in relationships. We create actively, and we create implicitly or tacitly. We create through the things that we directly say to our partner, and we create in a way that the way that we behave, the way that we engage the rest of the world. Our partners watch. The people who like us and want to court us watch, and then they say, that is what he likes, that is what he wants, and so I'll try to become that which he wants so that he can accept me. And so we do create by default, right? And so I talk about that. How do you create the woman that you want? How do a woman create the man that they want? And generally it's just about using affirmative phrases and statements to the person that you're around. So if I want someone to be supportive, I find every opportunity to tell them that they're supportive when they're doing something that gives the idea of support. So that means that she could be visiting her mother, and when she comes back, I say, you know, I really appreciate what you do for your family. You're so supportive. You're always there for them, and this is something that I always see in you. And I got to remember that creation and active creation is not a one moment thing. I can't say you're supportive today and then tomorrow say that you're unsupportive. We have to kind of like continue to drill that concept into that person until they begin to believe that that's who they are. And once a person believes that that's who they are, they become it.
But is that something that's organic? Does it? Because it seems to me, it sounds kind of like you're actively
Absolutely
doing this, whereas it's an assumption that it should be a given. So,
no, because you have to remember that culturally traits are learned. All right, everything is learned in coaches. We learn how to be giving. We learn how to be supportive. We learn how to be cooks and chefs. Those are things that you develop. When you place someone in a community, the values of the community becomes that person. And we can see that, and not to veer off into the topic, but we see that in communities that are low income. They have very different values for communities that are affluent or high income. We see that there's a difference in the way that they're culturally raised, and that becomes the way that they view the world. Their perceptions become influenced by it. And so the reality is that we are always actively doing something to change or create or evolve. And that means that being conscious of it is where you become more of a change agent, when you know the impact that your behaviors and the words that you say have. And just to kind of like move on a little bit away from it, let's look at it as a child. A child grows up and his parents are calling him stupid. Dad, you never get anything right. How are you so dumb? And this is something that we find prevalent in communities that are disadvantaged. And those children grow up to then believe that they can't learn. And so they use that, I've been this way since I was a kid. I always couldn't get it right. I always was clumsy. And then I always think back and say, but as a child, you're growing into developing this equilibrium, this balance, this ability to be more adept at things. You are supposed to be clumsy when you're young. You're supposed to not know these things when you're young. But because in, African American urban culture, we find that parents want children to grow up way faster than they are able to. And so we want them to do adult things at ages where they should be doing children things. We want them to respond to the world as adults at a time when they're not adults. And so we force them to take on this kind of idea that I have to be perfect at an age when you can't be. And that's because generally there's no time, there's limited resources, and parents are just trying to get things going, and they kind of expect young children to just be adults, and it's not possible.
And I think that that follows them into their relationships,
and
they want everything to be given at certain times, and And it's you spoke about culture and the culture of urban communities, and one of the things that I've seen is a switch and a change in culture in terms of relationships and the value of relationships.
Yeah.
Like I've had situations where I've saw a couple together and I've heard somebody say like, "Damn, y'all still together?" Like literally, it's like 3 years, and it's like, "Damn, you're still together?"
Yeah.
Where it's this disbelief that people have long-standing relationships. So, what do you think, has caused this shift within these communities that relationships aren't something that's valued in the same way that it used to be for our grandparents? And
one thing is that it's just a breakup of the family. We notice that it's just prevalent in the communities where people are not seeing relationships stable or stabilize. We see a relationship happen. We don't see the relationship stabilize and become one that is enduring. And so if you grew up at a time where that is the common images of a woman having more than one boyfriend, throughout the years, like she's never with that same guy, multiple child's fathers. And so it's easy for a child to say, "Dad, you still together?" Well, nobody in my community has had a relationship this long, why? Start asking the question like, why? You can't find nobody else? Values are shaped by what we see. And unfortunately, the question, like what you said that you heard, is a fact of the reality that they live in. Relationships are short term.
So speaking of,
but let's go to your question.
Okay.
Though. Yeah. Your question was, why aren't there longer?
Yeah.
Why don't we have these long relationships? One is because we look for perfection in our partners, and any time that there's an imperfection in our partner, we use it as a reason to break off. Also, we look for things to never ever have problems. And when we don't have problems, we don't become problem solvers. And so it is easy to run away from a problem. You don't solve it that way. When you run away from a problem, you leave the problem to fester for some other time. And so we have to learn how to endure through the ups and downs of relationships, the squabbles, the differences of opinions, even infidelities. You'll find that when you talk to some of the classic older couples that you were talking about, those grandfathers and grandmothers, she'll tell you about stories of infidelity and how she stood by and why that person, your grandfather or the grandmother, continued to come back or stay. I'm gonna tell you a story from a book called Homemade Love, right?
Okay.
It's by Virginia C. Cooper, I think it is. I might have the author's name wrong, but it's definitely a California J. Cooper. Anyway, in this book, it talks about this guy who wakes up one morning, looks in the mirror, he says, "You know what? I look gorgeous, man. And she's getting old, man. You know what, I'm gonna go out here and find me something nice and young, do my thing." And he gets up, says to her, "Look, baby, I'm leaving." And he just leaves, goes out. And when he goes out, he goes to this bar, he's sitting there, he sees some lady over there. Guy gets into an argument, pulls out a gun, shoots at somebody. He runs outside, the guy's right next to them, the police come, snatch him up. He snatched him up, beat him up, throw him in the paddy wagon. He had nothing to do with the situation. He's in the precinct, stressed out. They find out that it's not him. He got blood on his shirt, blood on his clothes. He leaves, he goes back out. When he goes back out, he says, "Oh, man, let me find somewhere to stay." So he goes to a boarding house really quickly to kind of, like one of those small hotels, get a room in there. And he goes in there and he's sitting in the room and he hears some other grumblings next door. And then the next thing you know, there's a whole bunch of fighting going on. He goes outside to look and the guy said, "What are you minding your business for? Why you minding my business?" Beats him up in the head, boom, drops him down the stairs. He goes to the hospital.
Okay.
He goes to the hospital, he gets bandaged up, he comes back out. He's looking around, he says, "What do I do?" He's stressed out, and he realized that it's not greener on the other side.
Yeah.
And then he walks back home. And when he walks back home, his wife is sitting at the table. And when he gets in, he looks at her, and he says, "I'm sorry." And she says, "I knew you'd be back." Okay. Sometimes you gotta let somebody go for them to come back. But you can't be so judgmental that you never let them re-enter into your life for some indiscretion that they did.
Well, let me stop you there. And I don't want to stop you, but I want to actually unpack this a little bit more, because what it sounds like, the 80-20 rules, shout out to Tyler Perry and why did I get married? But, what I don't want to do is I don't want to leave the viewers with this kind of like, you're putting in like an embedded excuse to excuse indiscretions. I really want to, like, why should a woman let a man back because of indiscretions? We have, especially in communities of color, there's high levels of HIV and AIDS, sexually transmitted diseases, all kind of things that can be exposed, or someone can be exposed to as a result of promiscuity and not being in the confines of a monogamous relationship. So what do you say to that? Like, when should a woman, just at some point be like, I had enough? Like, it's not just easy for you to just let somebody back after they betrayed your trust. And then somebody may add, if it was her, would you be so willing to let her back?
Well, I always look at these questions. I try not to pigeonhole what the world communicates to a relationship. Individuals have to understand the dynamic that they exist in. Every person has the ability to make a decision as to whether or not someone returns into that relationship. But before that they make that decision, make sure that it's not influenced by what you feel other people is going to think about you re-accepting that person.
Got you.
See, right now we're saying, well, why should she do it? Because everybody else is going to look at it like you stupid, right? But she knows the value of the person that's with her. Now, of course, when you talk about STDs, STIs, the nature of the world that we live in, that's a part of that package. But, that's something that can easily be addressed before you accept someone back into a relationship, but that doesn't mean that you can't. Yeah. And that's the biggest thing that, that I think about, is that I think sometimes we place societal judgments on every decision that we make. We do things because either people are going to think that we're strong, so we do things that make people believe that we're strong, when really we are just as vulnerable as anyone else. But we have to continue to put on that facade because we want them to see that, and we don't want to be judged as weak. And so, it's so much that goes on in the dynamic of relationship. And so, it's funny that we're having this particular angle of it, because I generally always says human beings are very complex. They change, in moments. They shift. They morph it into these different people all the time. And so we got to understand that something that doesn't bother me today may bother me tomorrow. The great part about it is trying to understand why those things occur. And when we understand why, we get to cause. And when we get to cause, we know how to maintain relationships. But if we stay at the surface and we look at the superficial things that people are doing, then we don't understand the reason, the engine, the motor that's motivating them to do those things.
So speaking of cause, another thing that's prevalent in our community, especially in relationships, is this this intimate partner violence, anger, domestic violence, and that's another reason why many relationships do not last, and where partners, whether it be a man or a woman, and whether it be a same-sex couple, but this notion of staying together because of the children, or because of this, where you still have a fear for your life, or still under so much duress within the relationship. And oftentimes we hear people, women speak out about this particular phenomenon, occurrence within our communities. But I, for one, as someone who facilitates domestic violence workshops for individuals that are accused of being a batterer, I'm one that I believe that it's important for men to be a part of those that speak out against this as well. What do you say for those particular situations? We don't want to get too much into it, but I think that this is another issue where you mentioned infidelity, but also it might be abuse in other ways as well.
Well, one thing that I can assure you is that no relationship is worth the physicality.
Yeah.
When you beat something to display your love, it shows a lack of control. And people who don't have control or a locus that they can manage their behaviors are dangerous. And so, that can always escalate into a situation where that person's life is at stake. And so when abuse is entered into a relationship, it changes the dynamic of a relationship. It's no longer about an exchange between two people, it's about power. And you know this as a domestic violence trainer, so the power dynamic changes relationships. And in fact, this is what I was talking about in the beginning, about letting people be their own agents.
Yeah.
You have to allow people to be and become who they want to become. But when I create for the person, I'm only suggestion, right? I'm only giving affirmations. I'm only encouraging. I'm not physically shaping that person. I'm not making them do anything. I'm suggesting, and auto-suggestion is one of the greatest things that we've learned about human beings, is that the more that you tell them something or show them something, the more that it becomes a part of their psyche. And so it can help to build someone up, or it can definitely destroy them, in the example of calling someone stupid as a child. And so, of course, I don't think anyone who talks about relationships, who's ever been in any relationships where they cared for someone, would care for someone and then at the same time try to destroy that thing. When you buy a possession, it's something that you really, really love, you take care of it, right? You got some nice shoes, you want to polish them. You don't poke holes in them and punch them. You don't scratch them against the wall, because that shows a contradiction, a dichotomy that doesn't fit. It's not consistent with the feeling that you're saying. Yeah. So a lot of times when in relationships we find power dynamics, and I speak about this as well, where people become abusive, and it's really because they believe that if that person realizes their own value, they'll see how invaluable I am, or valueless I am. I'm not going to say invaluable because we have a different interpretation of that, right? So valueless I am. And then they will want to move on. Yeah. And because most people find themselves built up on the idea of possessions. So I possess this beautiful girl, so that makes me someone. I possess these beautiful things, these cars, these rings, these chains, so it makes me somebody of value, when really
I'm empty inside.
I'm not.
So,
right?
So question, and this is a great subject that we're on, and one of the things that I've noticed about your speech is you found the words to really articulate yourself. And the reason why I'm keen in on the words is because words and our ability to use words will allow us to be in successful relationships, not only in just a romantic sense, but in a business sense, in an employment sense, in an educational sense. And what I found is many of our young men in particular lack vocabulary. Lack the vocabulary conducive to successful relationships in all these various sectors. And what happens is, as a result of lacking vocabulary in these areas, they may use or begin to use maladaptive speech that is not conducive to their overall development, especially as it relates to a relationship. So what would you say to women who may be in a relationship with someone that they truly love, someone that they truly care for, but this person appears not to speak, not to be able to communicate their feelings? What are some of the reasons why a man would not be able to communicate his feelings? And what do you have to say about those situations?
Whenever I do this is my pondering. I start doing this, I'm pondering deeply. The reason why I would see that happens often, it's because of the communities that many of these young men grow up in. When they're using slang as a primary mode of communication, slang becomes the only way to communicate because you've created that as a primary language. So when it's time to go beyond those words, those 150, 200 words that you've commonly used all day, to express a concept that's way deeper, the frustration sets in. I can't do it. I can't find the words. I don't know those words. And because someone doesn't understand the feeling, the frustration, the anger, the want, the need that you're going through, you become physical. Because you're frustrated not at them, but your own inability to make that clear, right? And this is really, it happens generally, even with adults. It's not just young men, it's adults. Finding words is something that requires initiative for the person. But as thought leaders and, you know, people who run programs, and this is kind of veering off our topic somewhat, but we have to make that a part of our lessons that we teach. We want people to understand that vocabulary is not just to make you appear great in the eyes of society, but it helps to widen and strengthen the relationships between you, your family. It gets people to not think for you, but for you to communicate your thoughts from that part of you. You know, when I grew up, one of the things that I always wanted to do was to express myself the way that I felt. And so it caused me to want to learn more words, because I wanted to say something specific. And it would always be someone who would say, so what you mean is that you feel this way. And I didn't have the word to say exactly what I felt, but I knew that that word that they told me wasn't the way I felt. But because I didn't have the word, I would just say, yeah, like that. But really, it wasn't. And so I always felt like people never really understood exactly what I was feeling. You know, I never got a chance to really communicate what I really was thinking. It just seems that people just told me what I thought. Oh, so what you really think is this. Oh, so what you're saying is that. And what you're feeling is this. And really, I wanted to say, no, I don't feel none of those things that you're saying. Those are not the words for me.
It's amazing that you bring that up, because
and so you take people's voice that way.
Yeah, and it's amazing because in doing men's group, and I often hear from the men themselves feeling that they're not able to articulate their words, or somebody is speaking over them, or interpreting things wrong. And one of the things in terms of men and women in our community is a different trajectory. Our young girls are maturing essentially already at a faster rate, and then you take into consideration graduating college at a higher rate, grad school at a higher rate, being employed at a higher rate, having longevity in employment at a higher rate, where many of the women in our community are engaged in relationships with men that may be on a high school level as it relates to vocabulary or less.
Absolutely.
So
there's this great, like, vast
chasm.
Yeah, between the two. And I think that it makes men feel vulnerable as well.
Inferior, yeah.
And so it goes back to what you were saying about developing this physicality in relationships. When you look at your girlfriend and she seems to be smarter, more successful, she's has more energy, she's more optimistic about life, and then you like, you know what, man, why is she so happy? You know, and not really realizing is that her world is created through the words that she knows. She knows her boundaries. She knows what is limits and what is limitless to her, while he
only sees limits.
That's right. You know, and I think that that's a problem. You know, we have to find ways to bring the education to our young men in a way that doesn't seem like it's sacrificing their integrity or their realness. It's just about developing who you are and being able to express that to the world.
Yeah. So question, you spoke about, you know, both men and women and the differences. And one of the things that we don't always want to look at is the problem, but rather how can we find solutions? So what is the solution that you would give for men and women to work together or to communicate better in terms of relationships, or it's just family in general? What are some of the things that we can do to help foster better communications between men and women within these communities?
For me, it's simple. Learning to understand people, right? When you understand people, it's psychology. It is learning people. When you learn people, it's funny that when you're trying to learn people, you do less judgment. But when you're trying to shape people because you want to impose something on them, then it comes with a judgment. So you're doing something that I dislike, I have a judgment on it, and so I want you to change it. But if you understand people, we try to find the best qualities in that person and then let them develop. But it's funny that no matter what a person shows outwardly, everyone has beautiful qualities latent in them. There is the potentiality to be everything. So even though somebody may not be showing a particular quality or disposition or leaning towards something, everyone has the ability to be great at everything. And so even if it doesn't show or display, I can still encourage it. I can still affirm it. I can still encourage it in a way that makes that person start to see that latency become a potentiality, and the potentiality to become a reality. Yeah. We want that to happen. We want that to happen. We want that to happen because then it becomes self-created. Even though I was there adding little flames to it, people take ownership of it. And this is the sense of agency that we keep talking about. Now, how does this all play into relationships? Because when you are in a world with other human beings, when you learn and grow, you grow and learn through others. And that's a relationship. You have a relationship to society. You have a relationship to your community. You have a relationship to your partner. This is about building and engaging in those environments, those people, those places. It's important that we see it that way. Then maybe relationships will develop and be more consistent and long and enduring. That's what we want, you know. And so I guess basically at the end of all of that is saying that in order to make relationships great, in order to make relationships last, we have to understand people. And to understand a person is going to take a lifetime, because human beings are the most complex beings on this planet. And so if we look at it that way, nothing you want is going to happen tomorrow or the day after. But there will be changes along that way. And if you can be satisfied with the small changes, trust me, you'll be satisfied with your relationship.
Well, I couldn't have said it any better. Oh my God, Mr. McBride. Thank you for being a part of the show today. Thank you for sharing your insight. I feel like as a male, I'm much better off in terms of hearing your perspective, being able to understand some of the issues that I may have in a relationship or in general, any kind of relationship. And I think that for our viewers, I'm pretty sure that they gain some insights as well. In particular, our young women, the viewers who are women, to hear from a male perspective, hear about relationships, because oftentimes we're siloed. We're not able to communicate these particular thoughts amongst ourselves, and we need to, because our communities are struggling, our relationships are struggling, and in some cases our children are struggling. So this has been another episode of Voices, Relationships, the importance of establishing relationships. And you've heard it here first from Mozito Says. So please feel free to check out his column. And also you'll be hearing much more from him. His book is soon to be released. And what's your thoughts on this subject? What's your thoughts about relationships? What's your thoughts about your own personal relationships? Has some of the things that we've discussed in this particular episode affected you in your own particular relationship? Let's hear from you. Once again, I'm your host, Keston Jones, signing off. Peace.
Peace.